Over the last several days, reactions have come pouring into the surprise letter released by Pope Benedict XVI. The reactions have come from across the ideological spectrum, from both within the Church and, surprisingly, without, and it illustrates the growing fractures between the various factions within the Church itself, which is an unfortunate situation, but I do think it reflects the times we live in, which I would characterize as being those times where all things are being revealed. The secrets of the Church are being poured out, as are the corrupt practices of secular leaders. So why not the internal fractures of the Church as well? It is time that the laity were made aware of the various factions within the hierarchy and where they stand on issues of orthodoxy and the moral teachings of the Church. Let's dive into this story, which is one of media corruption, really. From the perspective of some of us, we're seeing what amounts to a battle between modernists, though some have said that Benedict's letter might reflect a sort of ongoing correction in his understanding of the theological and moral state of the Church. Either way, most of us are aware of the divisions that exist in the Church. The reactions to this letter perfectly put those divisions on display for the rest of the Church and the whole world to see. Let's have a look at a few of these headlines. You'll see what I mean. First, we have the response from the National Catholic Reporter, which seems to have channeled a little bit of Anne Barnhart. No, that's not a dig at her work. I haven't a real opinion on that work either way. There's just an eerie parallel between what the distorter is saying here and her work when they say in this story, which has a headline, editorial, "One Pope is enough." And most of us would probably agree with the sentiment, and often wonder why Benedict continues to live in the Vatican and dresses like a modern pope. I'll leave the speculation and investigation into all of that to more interested persons. The distorter frames Benedict's response as a defense of his own papacy meant to undermine Francis, while at the same time declaring Benedict's papacy a failure. The anonymous author even goes as far as to suggest that a rivalry is forming between the two. Charming, right? And probably has no basis in reality, and I'll go into that in a bit. Something calling itself the Highlander echoes these ideas, saying that Benedict ignores the institutional problems that plague the Church and then praises Francis for his modernist agenda of deconstruction of the institutions that, in the author's estimation, are the cause of the problem, though he doesn't say why. No mention of the usual suspects of clerical celibacy, which is absolutely not the problem, no matter how much some people want to say that it is, nor the nebulous phantom enemy of clericalism. No, in this weird case, the blame is placed on the Church itself, with no mention of infiltration, betrayal of theological and philosophical roots that the Church had embraced since the 12th century, until very recently, or the scourge of modernism. Instead, Benedict is blamed, again, as is the Church itself. Amazingly, the author of that piece sings the praises of the bishop's sex seminar, or whatever they called it, which in reality accomplished nothing at all. But again, we live in clown world. And then there's the response from The Atlantic, which is a rather notorious one now, whose headline reads, "Pope Benedict says blame the 60s for priests' abuse." It's possibly the worst take of all of them, save for the one I'm saving for next. Here's a money quote for you to understand why I say that, and just how it shows just how bad the secular world is misunderstanding this issue. Quote, "Benedict didn't stay in the background. Instead, he published a letter that is incoherent, inaccurate, and at times truly bizarre. In his letter, he wrote that the news of the February conference had compelled him to action. I compiled some notes by which I might contribute one or two remarks to assist in this difficult hour," he wrote. Benedict alerted Francis that he'd be publishing the letter, but I can't begin to imagine how Francis responded. In his letter, Benedict blamed the sexual abuse crisis on the absence of God. This is a theological argument that's worth hearing out, although one could argue that, say, human agency was to blame for a crisis in which priests sexually abused minors and dioceses routinely covered up the abuse. But most of all, the Pope Emeritus blamed the crisis on the upheavals of 1968. Benedict has long been obsessed with that year as a destructive social force, and has written in the past about how destabilizing the sexual revolution and student protests were to the social order and to the Church's role as a moral authority." End quote. It gets stranger and worse from there. Read it if you like. The link is on the Sources blog. And I'll have something to say about this letter and Francis's role in it at the end. But possibly my favorite of these responses comes from none other than America Magazine, whose editor is Pastor Jimmy Martin of the Jesuit Church. Pope Francis fanfiction writer Austin Iveray found a way to spin the Benedict letter to say that it wasn't an attack on the Second Vatican Council or on Francis, which is an interesting take, to say the least, given that Benedict comes out several times and defends traditional positions that are presently under attack by the lackeys of the current pontiff. But even better is that line that sticks out to everyone who hears it, where Benedict says that we tried making a new church and it didn't turn out so well. That one really gets the noggin jogging. It seems obviously a dig at the spirit of Vatican II, if not at the council itself, but of course the most strident defenders of the status quo can't admit that. This quote from Iveray is mind-bogglingly hilarious. Quote, "What is the connection? Benedict blames a collapse in Catholic moral theology that left the Church defenseless against these changes in wider society. This is not an attack on the theology of Vatican II. Benedict notes approvingly that the Council had sought to root moral theology in Scripture rather than natural law, but he says that theologians never quite succeeded, at least at the time, in expressing a systematic morality capable of replacing the old natural law edifice. And so the Church ended up in a halfway house of morality, needing to be determined by the purposes of human action." End quote. How is that not an attack on the Council? The Council divorced the Church from Thomistic philosophy, with its clear teaching of moral law that is rooted in sacred Scripture, as most natural theologians will actually tell you. The Council broke away and endorsed the new theology of the likes of Karl Rahner and Desjardins and other modernists who taught situational ethics, whose consequences have been obvious. Iveray's response is what you would expect from those who do mental gymnastics for a living. If you want to read his article for yourself, I have it available on the Sources blog, which is linked in the description of this video. On the other side of this is the response published by LifeSite, written by May Hickson, which connects the sexual revolution of the 60s to liberalization and modernization of theology in Germany that then spread throughout the Church, and which itself caused a catastrophe among the priests and religious. Little mention is made of the role of psychologists who were brought in by bishops at this time, especially in Germany, to teach sexual morality to priests, nuns, and male religious, with the predictable disastrous effects. The fruits of the 60s was an ever-increasing revolutionary mindset, sexual dysfunction that grows and spreads daily, and the destruction of families. The author points to that from personal experience and first-hand eyewitness, and I can attest to it, though I was not alive in the 1960s. We still live in that revolution, but it didn't appear suddenly from nowhere until the Church examines the origins of the 60s and its revolution that came with it, until it examines the role the Church played in the 60s on both sides of the revolution and the effect her enemies had on subverting her. We will continue to go nowhere in addressing this problem. LifeSite also published an interview with Cardinal Moeller, who said Benedict has the duty to preach the moral truth about the state of things. It's a translation of a European interview, I think Italian. It echoes the other LifeSite article, which really isn't surprising in the slightest. So what is a Catholic to do? Do we take sides? Personally, I have issues with Cardinal Ratzinger's role in the Council, and in the years after the Council, before his becoming Pope Benedict XVI. That doesn't mean that I don't think he'd be a turn of sorts towards something resembling sanity if he were to magically become Pope again, but the idea that he's going to come sweeping into the papacy again is a fantasy, and we all know that in our hearts. In my mind, this breaking into factions illustrates my guiding principle in understanding our situation. Those famous words of Sister Lucia of Fatima: a diabolic disorientation has entered the Church. While Benedict's letter does point to the liberalization and sexualization of the priests and bishops of the Church, especially in his own home country of Germany, what it doesn't address is the infiltration of the Church, or even admit that the revolution of ideas leading to the disastrous council are to blame. Liberal defenders of the current order are correct in one thing, that we had these cases of abuse happening in the 1940s and 50s. One really only has to look at Marcel for an example of this. The testimony of Belladad is also instructive here. She who helped plant the seeds of our crisis in the Church in the 1930s on behalf of Joseph Stalin, and swore after her conversion that there were 4 cardinals in the U.S. who were communist plants who had been planted not to turn the Church into a communist organization, but to corrupt it to the point of destruction. She was saying this in the 1950s before Congress. We are living now in the fruit of her work, and now it's the time that those in question who are of good heart and good intention must speak forcefully about it, regardless of the cost. I do count Benedict XVI among those of good heart and good intention. His document was a good start in the end, but it leaves many of us feeling like outsiders looking into an argument among liberals and neoconservative Catholics who are trying to figure out how the mess in the church was created, when it was the new ideas they all largely agree on that were key to this crisis today. You really only have to look to see his praising of Hans von Balthasar in his own document for that. So pray for the illumination for these people and the conversion of the heart of all involved. To close, what of this letter in Francis? Well, to be sure, Pope Francis had to have approved of it. Both pontiffs share a personal secretary who serves as their go-between. Francis certainly knew of the letter and probably read it himself. He had to have approved of its publication, which then begs a lot of questions itself. If there is a strife going on because of this letter, I'd bet it's between the factions in the Novus Ordo who support one against the other, not between the two men in any overt way. Of course, I could be wrong about that, and evidence of my possible being wrong is that the letter was originally published on LifeSite News and its similar conservative outlets in Europe first, before mainstream sources ran with it. That hasn't been lost on the likes of Pastor Jimmy Martin of the Jesuit Church, who has been crying on social media about how inappropriate the letter is. But we really didn't expect much better from him anyway. So what do you think? Do you think there's a division between Benedict and Francis? Do you adhere to the idea that Benedict is Francis's prisoner? If so, why? I'm actually really honestly curious. Anyway, as always, pray for the church, stop sinning, and say a rosary every day. I'm Anthony Stein. Viva Cristo Rey.